The snow came without a sound, a thief in the night. By dawn, it was a predator. Elara stood at the cabin's single window watching the world disappear. The wind drove the flakes sideways, erasing the fence line, the creek bed, the very shape of the hills. It was a thick, wet, smothering snow, the kind that broke the backs of foolish animals and the spirits of the men who owned them. The whole county, she knew, would be a graveyard of frozen livestock by noon. Silas Croft, the banker, had told her as much last fall. "A woman alone can't weather a winter like the one that's coming," he'd said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "You'll be wiped out. Better to sell to me now. Take what little you can get." She had said no. Now the wind howled like a chorus of all the men who had laughed at her, who had pitied her, who had called her a fool for buying another man's garbage. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass, the silence in the small cabin, a stark contrast to the fury outside. She was not afraid. She was simply waiting. Down in the sunken basin, sheltered by the earth itself, her 90 ewes and their impossible crop of lambs were safe. The arithmetic she had done by candlelight, night after night, was about to be proven true or false by the cruelest abacus of all, the storm. 6 months earlier, the dust had been the problem. It coated everything in a fine red powder, a constant reminder of the land's thirst. Elara stood by the auction pens, her hands knotted in the fabric of her worn dress, trying to be invisible. The air was thick with the smell of manure, sweat, and the bitter tang of cheap cigars. Men in broad-brimmed hats shouted bids, their voices confident and booming, slapping each other on the back as they bought up prime breeding stock. Elara waited. She waited until the main auction was over, until the sun was a hot weight on the back of her neck, and the important men had retired to the saloon to celebrate their acquisitions. What was left was the cull pen, the old, the lame, the barren, the ones a rancher kept out of habit until they became too expensive to feed through a winter. They were a flock of skeletons draped in ragged fleece, their heads low, their eyes dull. 90 of them. The auctioneer, eager to be done, didn't even bother with a proper call. "Who'll give me anything for this lot of mouths? Butcher's price, ladies and gents, and that's being generous." A few men laughed. One shouted, $5 a head if you deliver 'em skinned." More laughter. Elara stepped forward from the shadow of the water tower. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. $9, she said. The auctioneer squinted, shading his eyes. He didn't recognize her at first, just a slip of a woman in a faded calico dress, her face smudged with dust. Then a slow recognition dawned. Ah, the widow. The one who'd inherited that useless patch of dry creek land east of town. A wave of pity, mingled with amusement, rippled through the remaining crowd. Silas Croft, who seemed to be everywhere there was money or misery, stepped away from a conversation. He smoothed his waistcoat and approached her, his smile avuncular and entirely false. "My dear girl," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "What are you thinking? These are culls. They're done. You'd be better off burning your money for warmth." She met his eyes, her own gaze steady and unreadable. $9 a head, she repeated to the auctioneer, her voice a little louder this time. The auctioneer shrugged. It was more than he'd expected. "Sold to the lady for $9 a head. Lord help her." The men chuckled and shook their heads as they dispersed. A woman's folly. Croft lingered. "That's $810, he said, his tone laced with a condescending sorrow. "That's nearly half of what your husband left you, on sheep that won't live to see the spring shearing." She didn't rise to the bait. She simply walked to the clerk's table, counted out the worn bills, and took the receipt. Being right, she was learning, made no sound at all. The only thing to do was the work. Driving them home was a slow, pathetic procession. The 3 miles to her land took the better part of the afternoon. The ewes stumbled, their bones sharp beneath their thin coats. They were a flock of ghosts, moving through a landscape of dust and dying grass. A few people watched from their homesteads as she passed, their expressions a mixture of pity and scorn. She heard a woman say to her husband, "There goes good money after bad." Elara kept her eyes forward, her hand resting on the back of the oldest ewe, a creature with one cloudy eye and a notched ear, who seemed to have taken on the role of matriarch. The sun was setting by the time they reached her property, 160 acres of what the town called goat pasture. The creek was a ribbon of cracked mud. The grass was brittle and pale. It was not much, but it was hers. Her husband had bought it with a dream in his eyes, a dream that had died with him 6 months after. Now it was just a place to survive. She let the sheep spread out, their weary forms dotting the parched landscape. They began to graze with a kind of grim determination, seeking out the smallest, toughest blades of grass the cattlemen ignored. She sat on the porch of her tiny 2-room cabin and watched them until the light failed, a knot of fear and resolve tightening in her stomach. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. $810 spent. Another $1,000 owed to Silas Croft's bank on the land itself, due at the end of May. She had maybe $200 left for feed and supplies to get through the winter. It was an impossible equation. Unless there was something everyone else had missed. The next morning, she was up before the sun, her hands already aching. She didn't own a horse, so she began to walk the perimeter of her land, a task that took hours. She was looking for water, for forage, for some hidden advantage. Most of the land was exactly as it appeared, sun-baked and poor. But in the far northeast corner, the land dipped unexpectedly. It wasn't a canyon, just a wide, shallow basin, perhaps 50 acres in all, invisible from the road. The ground there was softer, damper. A thin trickle of a spring, barely a damp spot on the surface, seeped from a rock formation at the basin's lowest point. And the grass, it was different, shorter but thicker and greener. A variety the high plains cattle ranchers despised because it wouldn't grow tall enough for a cow to get a good mouthful. But for sheep, it was perfect. She knelt and touched the ground. It was cool. This was it. The place the sky had forgotten, but the land had remembered. A voice startled her. "You see with your hands? That is good." An old man stood at the lip of the basin, leaning on a crooked staff. He was weathered as the rock beside him, his face a road map of deep creases. It was Old Man Hemlock, the Basque sheep herder who lived alone in the hills and was considered half wild by the townsfolk. She had seen him from a distance, but had never spoken to him. He looked down at the sheep and then at her. He didn't have the pitying look of the men at the auction. His eyes were dark and knowing. "They say these are culled," he said, his voice raspy, accented. "They are not culled. They are survivors. A flock that has seen a hard winter knows how to live through another. A fat sheep is a foolish sheep." He pointed with his staff at the basin. "This is a good place. The north wind cannot find you here." Elara found her voice. "They say it won't be enough to get them through." He spat on the ground. "They," he said, the word full of contempt. "They look at the sky and see only what they want. The land remembers what the sky forgets. You listen to the land, little one. It speaks a truer story." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the hills as quietly as he had arrived. Elara stayed there for a long time, her hand on the cool earth. The land remembers. It became her mantra, her prayer, the silent answer to the town's mockery. By June, a routine had settled in, as comforting as a worn blanket. Elara rose in the dark, her first chore to haul water from the well near the cabin to the troughs she'd built in the basin. She would spend the morning there, mending the old fences, clearing brush, or simply sitting on a rock, watching the flock. She learned their habits, the subtle language of their movements. She learned to tell from the flick of an ear which ewe was nervous, which was content. They were no longer just a mass of wool and bone. They were individuals, and they were changing. The steady diet of the basin's tough, nutrient-rich grasses was working a slow magic. Their ribs were less prominent, their movements less halting. A healthy sheen was returning to their wool. It was during these quiet mornings that the boy appeared. His name was Finn, a pale, silent child of 10 from a neighboring homestead, the youngest of 7 brothers and forgotten in the clamor of his own family. He would simply materialize at the edge of the basin, watching her with wide, solemn eyes. For a week he said nothing. Elara said nothing back, simply nodding a greeting. One day he pointed to the old matriarch with the cloudy eye. "That one's the queen," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Elara smiled. "I suppose she is." From then on, he was her shadow. He helped her haul water, his thin arms straining. He had a gift with the animals. They were calm around him. He began to name them. The queen was Bess. A scrappy ewe with a black patch over one eye was Pirate. A particularly gentle one was Willow. He gave them all names, a litany he would recite softly as they grazed. The flock was no longer a unit of currency, a collection of assets. It was Bess and Pirate and Willow and 87 others. It was a family. The town, of course, saw none of this. They saw the widow and the waif, wasting their days on a failing venture. "She's got that simple boy doing her chores now," she heard one woman remark at the general store. A shame for both of them. Elara bought her flour and salt, met the woman's gaze without expression, and walked out. Their words were just noise, like the buzzing of flies. The truth was in the basin. The truth was the growing weight of the ewes, a secret she kept like a coal, banked low under ash. She spent her evenings patching the old shed, reinforcing the roof, preparing for winter. And she did the arithmetic. Feed costs, salt licks, the looming banknote. But now a new number entered the equation. Lambs. Old Man Hemlock had appeared again one afternoon, looked over the flock with his shrewd eyes, and grunted. "Good bellies," he'd said. "You will have a strong lambing." Many twins. These old ones, they know the way. They save their strength for the children. Hope, a terrifying and unfamiliar feeling, began to take root. If she could get a good crop of lambs, if she could get a decent price for the wool in the spring, she might just survive. She might just prove them all wrong. The thought was so audacious she hardly dared to think it. Instead, she focused on the work. Day after day after day, the slow, methodical labor of keeping things alive. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, baking the high plains to a cracked brown shell. The creek on her land vanished completely, leaving only baked mud and the white skeletons of crawfish. The ranchers in town complained, their cattle growing thin, the price of hay rising with every rainless week. But down in Elara's basin, the small spring still seeped, a dark, damp patch that drew the sheep in the heat of the day. The tough grass, with its deep roots, stayed green. Her flock was an island of placid contentment in a sea of worry. She began the shearing herself, a task she had only read about. She didn't have the money to hire a crew, and besides, she didn't want anyone. least of all Silas Croft, getting a true measure of her flock's health. She started with Bess, the old queen, who stood with a patient, trusting stillness as Elara worked the clumsy hand shears. The fleece came off in a thick, heavy blanket. It was surprisingly clean and dense, the fibers long and strong. It wasn't the brittle, worthless wool of a half-starved animal. It was good. It was valuable. Working with Finn, they sheared 10 ewes a day. It was back-breaking work under the relentless sun. Her hands, already calloused, became raw and stiff. By the end of 2 weeks, the shed was filled with burlap sacks stuffed with wool, smelling richly of lanolin and dry grass. She had kept her secret, but secrets have a way of getting out. One afternoon, Silas Croft's buggy crested the rise. He drove down the lane, his movements crisp and proprietary, as if he already owned the place. He tied his horse and approached the porch where Elara was mending a harness, his smile as wide and empty as the prairie sky. "Miss Elara," he began, removing his hat. "I was just passing by. Thought I'd check on how you were faring in this dreadful heat." His eyes, however, weren't on her. They were scanning the property, noting the empty pasture, the silent cabin. He couldn't see the basin from here. "We're managing," she said, her voice even. She didn't stop her work. "Managing?" he said, a note of theatrical concern in his voice. "My dear girl, the whole county is burning up. I've had to extend notes for a dozen ranchers. Good men with prime stock. A woman alone with a flock of coals. It must be a terrible burden." He let the words hang in the air. This was the purpose of his visit, to plant the seed of despair. "I'm here to help," he continued, stepping closer. "I'll be frank. That flock is a liability now. They won't survive the winter without a king's ransom in hay. I have a buyer for the pelts. He won't pay much, but it's more than you'll have when they starve to death. Let me take them off your hands. I'll give you $3 a head. It's a generous offer, born of respect for your late husband. $3. A third of what she'd paid. He was offering to buy her failure, to profit from the ruin he was so certain was coming. She finished threading the needle, pulled the stitch tight, and set the harness aside. She looked up at him, her face calm. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Croft, but they're not for sale." His smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the corners. The mask of concern slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Stubbornness is a luxury, Elara, one you cannot afford. That note is due in May. There will be no extensions. The bank is not a charity." "I'm aware of the date," she said. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching for a crack in her composure. Finding none, he put his hat back on with a sharp, irritated motion. "As you wish. Don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and walked back to his buggy, the dust puffing up around his polished boots. She watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was not a wolf, who was at least honest in its hunger. He was a vulture, content to circle and wait for death. The first chill of autumn was a relief, a clean, sharp edge to the air. The days shortened and the light took on a golden, slanted quality. In the basin, the ewes were fat and slow, their bellies swelling. The arithmetic by candlelight had become a nightly ritual, a conversation with herself. 90 ewes. If even half of them had twins, as Hemlock predicted, and half had singles, that was 135 lambs. At the going rate, even for crossbred lambs, that was. It was more than the note. It was survival. It was freedom. The numbers were intoxicating, but she held them close, a dangerous and precious secret. One afternoon, a wagon with a broken wheel brought an unexpected visitor. A man named Abernathy, a wool buyer from a city 200 miles east, was stranded on the road bordering her property. He was a small, fussy man with spectacles and soft hands, clearly out of his element. Elara saw his plight from the cabin and brought him a dipper of cold water. While Finn ran to fetch the heavy jack from the shed, Abernathy looked around at the parched, seemingly empty land. "Hard country," he commented, wiping his brow. "I don't know how anyone makes a go of it." Just then the flock, which had been grazing at the far end of the basin, began to move toward the spring. They flowed over the lip of the hollow, a river of gray and white wool, startling Abernathy with their sudden appearance. He stared, his mouth slightly agape. "Good heavens," he said. He was not a rancher, but he was a man who had spent 30 years looking at sheep. He might not know how to raise them, but he knew what he was seeing. He saw the deep bodies, the clear eyes, the placid way they carried their heavy bellies. He walked slowly toward the fence, his earlier frustration forgotten. He reached a hand over, and Pirate, ever bold, allowed him to touch her fleece. He worked his fingers into the wool, his expression shifting from curiosity to professional assessment. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The crimp, the length, in this country, after this summer." He turned back to Elara, his eyes sharp with a new interest. "Ma'am, who do you sell your wool to?" "I haven't sold this clip yet," she said. "I expect you sell to Mr. Croft in town?" he asked. "Everyone sells to Croft. I haven't spoken to him about it." He took off his spectacles and polished them, a thoughtful, calculating look on his face. "Croft is a consolidator. He buys low, mixes qualities, and sells high. A fleece like this," he gestured to Pirate, "gets lost in a batch of mediocre clips. It's a waste." Finn returned, dragging the jack, and the two of them set to work on the wheel. As they finished, Abernathy made a decision. He scribbled on a piece of paper from his pocketbook. "This is my card, and this," he wrote a figure, "is what I will pay you per pound for your entire clip in the spring, delivered to the railhead. That's 20 cents a pound more than Croft is likely to offer you on his best day." He handed her the paper. The number made her breath catch. It was a price reserved for the finest merino flocks, not for a band of forgotten culls. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. He smiled, a genuine, respectful smile. "Because, ma'am, quality is quality. And because I have a hunch that a woman who can get wool like this, off land like this, in a year like this, is someone I want to be in business with. And frankly, I don't much care for Silas Croft's methods." He tipped his hat, climbed onto his repaired wagon, and drove off, leaving Elara standing by the fence with a piece of paper that felt as heavy and real as a gold coin. The world had noticed. The secret was no longer entirely hers. Lambing began in the cold, clear days of late February. It came gently at first, a few singles born to the strongest ewes. Elara and Finn practically lived in the shed, which she had converted into a nursery, its stalls filled with clean straw. They worked by lantern light, their breath misting in the cold air, helping a struggling mother, drying a new lamb, making sure it found its first meal. Then, as Hemlock had predicted, the twins started. Ewe after ewe produced 2 healthy, vigorous lambs. They were small but sturdy, a testament to their mother's resilience. The shed filled with the soft bleating of lambs and the answering calls of their mothers. The arithmetic changed again, night after night. By the 3rd week, the count was staggering. 90 ewes had produced 162 living lambs. The basin was teeming with new life, the small white forms dotting the green grass like wildflowers. It was a miracle born of patience and observation. a fortune grown on land everyone had called worthless. The town was beginning to talk. Travelers on the main road could now see the lambs in the basin, a startling number of them. The whispers changed from pity to a grudging curiosity. Silas Croft heard the whispers too. He made another visit, this time without the pretense of a social call. He stood by the fence, his face a tight mask of disbelief, counting. He could not deny what he was seeing. "A surprising turn of luck," he said, his voice clipped. He did not congratulate her. "You'll need to sell the lambs quickly. A glut is coming. The price will drop. I can take the lot off your hands now. $5 a head. That will clear your note and leave you with a small profit." It was a better offer than before, but it was still theft. He was trying to buy her miracle before the rest of the world realized its true worth. "They're not ready yet," she said calmly, turning back toward the cabin. "And I have another buyer for the wool." His face darkened. "Abernathy," he spat the name. "He can't match my shipping rates. You'll lose money dealing with him." "That's my concern, Mr. Croft." She left him standing there, his fury a palpable thing in the cool spring air. He had underestimated her, and he knew it. His condescension had curdled into something far more dangerous: envy. As March wore on, the weather grew strange. The days were unnaturally warm, luring buds out on the trees and turning the hills a shade of impossible green. The big ranchers, eager to take advantage of the early grass, moved their massive flocks to the high summer pastures on the plateaus. It was the way it was always done, but Elara felt a deep unease. She remembered Hemlock's words: "Listen to the land." The birds were too quiet. The air had a strange, heavy stillness to it. One evening, Hemlock appeared at her door. He held out his hand, palm up. It was trembling slightly. "The air is afraid," he said. He looked north at a sky that was a placid, cloudless blue. "Big snow is coming. A white wolf. It will come when the moon is full." The moon was a week from full. No one else saw it. They saw an early spring, a gift. Elara saw a trap. The next day, she and Finn began moving the entire flock, ewes and lambs, out of the open basin and into the most sheltered part of the property, a narrow, wooded draw at the base of the hills behind her cabin, protected on 3 sides by steep, rocky walls. It was a tremendous amount of work. The townspeople watched her, moving sheep downhill into the woods when the best grass was blooming up high. They shook their heads. The widow's luck had finally made her lose her mind. She was doing everything backward. The storm arrived exactly as Hemlock had predicted, on the night of the full moon. It began not with a gentle dusting, but with a sudden, violent assault. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in an hour. The wind screamed down from the north, a physical force that rattled the small cabin to its foundations. Then came the snow, thick and blinding. Elara and Finn sat by the stove listening to the blizzard's rage. Finn, usually so quiet, was pale with worry. "The lambs," he whispered. "They're safe," Elara said, her voice more confident than she felt. "The draw protects them from the wind, and the trees keep the worst of the snow off. They'll huddle together. They know how to survive. They're smart." She hoped it was true. For 2 days and 2 nights, the world was nothing but a roaring whiteness. The snow piled in immense drifts, burying fences, swallowing sheds. On the 3rd morning, the wind died. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. The sun rose on a world transformed, sculpted in brilliant, lethal white. The snow was 4 feet deep on the level ground, and the drifts were twice the height of a man. News began to trickle in, carried by the few men on strong horses who could break a trail. The stories were horrifying. The flocks on the high plains had been caught in the open. with no shelter. The sheep had drifted with the wind until they piled up in ravines or against fence lines, where they were buried alive and suffocated or froze. The losses were catastrophic. Men who had counted their wealth in thousands of head were wiped out. The ranchers who had laughed at Elara's culled ewes had lost everything. The storm that had ruined the proud and the prosperous had spared the humble. As the snow began to melt under the strong sun, turning the world to a sea of mud, Elara and Finn dug their way to the draw. Her heart was in her throat. The entrance was drifted over, a solid wall of white. They shoveled for an hour, their muscles screaming in protest until they broke through. And there, in the sheltered space, was the flock. They were huddled, they were hungry, but they were alive, every single one. The lambs, protected in the center of the mass of warm, woolly bodies, bleated and staggered to their feet. A wave of relief so powerful it made her knees weak washed over Elara. It had worked. Her caution, her decision to listen to the land instead of to common wisdom, had saved them. The arithmetic was no longer about survival. It had become the arithmetic of victory. She had the only significant flock of breeding ewes and lambs left in the entire county. It was another week before the roads were clear enough for a buggy. Silas Croft was the first to arrive. He came not with offers, but with official-looking papers in his hand. He found Elara by the newly mended corral, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes clear and steady. He did not bother with pleasantries. His face was a mask of grim satisfaction. He believed her to be like all the others, ruined, helpless. "A tragedy," he said, his voice devoid of any real sympathy. "The entire county is devastated. I've come about the note, Elara. It's due in 6 weeks, but under the circumstances, the bank has to call in its insecure loans. I'm here to foreclose." He held out the papers. One person alone. The phrase echoed in her mind. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the culmination of his patient circling. She looked at the papers in his hand, then looked at him. She felt no fear, only a cold, clear anger. "You seem to be in a hurry, Mr. Croft." "It's just business," he said with a shrug. "You have nothing left." "No one does." "Is that so?" she said softly. She turned and walked toward the basin, which was now a carpet of vibrant green, fed by the melting snow. "Come with me." He followed, a look of confusion on his face. She led him to the lip of the hollow and stopped. He came to stand beside her and looked down. He froze. The basin was a sea of life. Ewes, fat and healthy, grazed peacefully. And everywhere were lambs. They kicked and bucked and played, a tide of bouncing white against the green. It was not a scene of devastation. It was a picture of impossible abundance. The color drained from Croft's face. He stared, speechless, visibly doing the math in his head. The value of this flock, in a county with no other breeding stock, was astronomical. He had come to pick over a corpse and had found a queen on her throne. Just then, 2 more wagons pulled into the lane. It was a delegation of her neighbors, the same men who had pitied and mocked her. Their faces were grim, their shoulders slumped with defeat. Their leader, a rancher named Cole, a proud man now humbled, stopped before her, twisting his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with emotion, We heard you were spared. We've been wiped out, all of us. We need to rebuild. We need breeding stock. We know you can name your price, and we'll pay it, whatever it is." All eyes were on her. Croft, recovering his composure, stepped forward. "Now, let's be sensible," he said, his voice oily again. "Mrs. Elara and I were just discussing a business arrangement. The bank will be handling the dispersal of the flock to ensure a fair. The bank will be doing no such thing, Elara said, her voice cutting through his. She looked past him at the desperate faces of her neighbors. She saw their fear, their pride, their ruin. She could have destroyed them. She could have charged a price that would have made her wealthy and put them in her debt for a generation. She looked at Finn, who stood beside her, his hand resting on Bess's neck. She thought of the slow, patient work of the land that had remembered. This was the final calculation, the one not done with numbers. She looked at Cole. $10 for a ewe lamb, she said. 15 for a ram. That's a fair price, not a disaster price. A collective sigh of disbelief and gratitude went through the small crowd. It was more than fair. It was generous. It was a gift. Croft stared at her, his face contorted with rage. His plan to control the county's recovery, to profit from the misery of others, was evaporating before his eyes. In his fury, he made a mistake. "You fool," he hissed at her, his voice low but audible to those nearby. "You could have had a fortune. How did you manage to save all 162 lambs anyway?" A sudden silence fell. Cole and the other men turned to look at Croft. Elara's face remained calm, but her eyes narrowed. She had never told anyone the exact count. Only she and Finn knew that number. How did he know? He had been spying. He had been lurking, counting, waiting for her to fail, so sure that she would. The slip exposed him completely, revealing the rot of his character in front of the very men he sought to control. He saw the realization dawn on their faces and knew he was finished. The exchange happened right there, in the muddy track beside the basin. Elara sold 20 ewe lambs and 10 rams to her neighbors, not for cash they didn't have, but for signed notes, witnessed by all present. It was a foundation of trust on which the community could rebuild. Then she turned to Silas Croft. From the pocket of her dress, she pulled a small, tightly wrapped oilskin pouch. She untied it and counted out the cash she had received from Abernathy for the first small clip of wool, supplemented by the sale of a few older ewes to the butcher before the storm. It was the exact amount of the note on the land, plus interest. She held the money out to him. "Here," she said, her voice clear and ringing in the quiet afternoon. "This is for the land. In full. Now get off my property." Croft stared at the money as if it were poison. To be paid in full, publicly, by the woman he had intended to ruin was the deepest humiliation. His face was a mottled red. Without a word, he snatched the bills from her hand, stuffed them into his coat, and stalked back to his buggy. He climbed in, whipped his horse, and fled down the lane, pursued by the silent, contemptuous stares of the assembled ranchers. He was a man who had lost more than a business deal. He had lost his power, the carefully constructed illusion of his own importance. As his buggy disappeared, a quiet cheer went up from the men. They surrounded Elara, their gratitude clumsy but sincere. They thanked her not just for the sheep, but for the chance she was giving them. They saw her now not as a foolish widow, but as the person who had saved them. She deflected their praise with a quiet grace, her focus already turning back to the work that remained. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, she stood with Finn on the porch, watching the flock settle for the night. The air was clean, washed by the storm, and smelled of wet earth and new grass. Finn finally broke the silence. "We did it," he said, his voice full of a quiet awe. "Bess and Pirate and all the others. We did it." Elara put a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, we did," she said. Old Man Hemlock emerged from the twilight as if summoned by the peacefulness of the hour. He leaned on his staff, looking out over the basin teeming with life. He nodded slowly, a rare, deep smile cracking the leather of his face. He didn't look at Elara, but at the land itself. "The sky forgets," he said softly, his voice a gravelly murmur. "It sends the sun. It sends the storm. It has no memory. But the land remembers." Elara looked out at her flock, at the green basin that had been her secret and her salvation, at the cabin that was now truly hers. The mockery of the town had faded into a distant echo. The fear of failure was gone. In their place was a quiet, unshakable sense of peace. She had listened not to the voices of men, but to the truer, older voice of the earth, and it had rewarded her with a payday no bank could ever give her. It was the fortune of being right where everyone else had been wrong, a wealth measured not in dollars, but in the steady, living pulse of 162 beating hearts